Sometimes it's interesting how one thing leads to another. When I was in about 5th grade, I went to Canada for the summer. Having moved at 7 from Canada to the United States, I would spend each summer 6 weeks, 2 months with my grandparents. Sometimes my family would come for a few weeks, but other times I was there alone. What greater way to learn a lot than to be with elderly people who had gone through so many things in their lifetime, who had the calm, the patience, the work ethic, and above anything else, the unbelievable love for their grandson. I remember how delicious my grandmother's food was, from pierogies to cakes to fresh fruits and vegetables in the garden, anything you could think of. Grapes, cherries, sour cherries, nectarines, peaches, raspberries, strawberries, apples. Anything you wanted, you would just go pick it right off the vine or the bush. And the garden, salad and tomatoes and beans and onions and pumpkins and anything you would really want. My grandfather would wake up 5:30 in the morning. He'd make some instant coffee and read the Bible. Occasionally he'd nibble on some bread or a cookie, never wanting to throw anything away. He'd often eat stale bread, not wanting it to go to waste. These things didn't always make sense at the time. I'm not sure if it was this summer, but my grandmother made a cake with cherries in it, and the juice of the cherries seeped out in an orbit around the cherry. Oh, it was so delicious I nearly ate the entire cake in one evening. So when I came home to America that year, I had gained some weight, become a bit chubby. My father was upset at this, and he didn't know it at the time, but I hid by his door while he was sort of telling my mother off. Look what they did to him, look what they did to him, he's never going back. And of course he was a bit irritated and exaggerating, but at the time I didn't know it and cried. Oh, I cried at the idea of never going back to see my grandparents again. But it also struck me that I was fat. That idea was reinforced, true or not. I mean, I really wasn't that bad. But the idea was reinforced at the beginning of that school year, maybe 6th grade it was, when someone who considered himself one of my best friends looked at me and in absolute seriousness said, I had no idea you had a double chin. Oh, I got so red, I tried so hard not to cry, I was so embarrassed. And from then on I had a complex. I wouldn't want to take my shirt off, trying to change in the locker room as quickly as possible. I was one of those guys who'd go into the swimming pool with his shirt on because he was embarrassed. And that's all I began to think about. Well, during that year in PE, I was getting a bad grade, and the teacher told me that you better be able to do the mile in 15 minutes or you're not going to pass the class. And I didn't care so much, except I thought about how angry and how much trouble I'd get in if I got a bad grade. So I started to do something. I would walk the straight part, jog the curve, walk the straight part, jog the curve. And it was all that I could do. I'd be out of breath after running a little less than 100 meters. So by the end of the year, I had done a little better, and we convinced my father to let me go back again, and I swore and promised I wouldn't gain too much weight. And I tried to be sure to watch what I ate and did a bunch of sit-ups every day, and I don't know, I did my best. And when I returned, I remember at the beginning of the year, we had a nurse, and the nurses would, check you for hernia, check your weight, check your height. And I remember clearly when she checked my height and weight, she said, oh, look at you, you weighed 114 pounds last year and you weigh the same this year, you just gained 4 inches in height. So essentially I stretched up and grew. And I really didn't think about it at the time, but that year I started to try to jog a little bit more. Pretty soon I could finish the mile in easily under 15 minutes, and then 12, and then 11. And I started to make a game out of it to see how many laps I could run. Eventually 5 laps, 6 laps. Maybe getting close to starting my 7th. By 8th grade the following year I could run 2 miles or 8 laps in 15 minutes. And I kept trying to break my time, and I'd secretly take my brother's running windbreaker because I thought it was going to make me a real runner. And 8th grade I had PE at the beginning of the day, so I would jog in from my house 2 blocks away and do my best to run. One day, in fact, I tried to run the mile as fast as I could and just run 4 laps. And it was a little bit annoying, but someone tried to run with me and even beat me at the end. And I ran under 6 minutes, 5 minutes and 50 something, or 30 something. And the coach, the PE teacher, really encouraged me I should run. Now, I was sort of overwhelmed at the idea of racing 3 miles in high school in cross country, and I thought it was so much, even though I had already run, 9 laps, almost 10, almost 2.5 miles in PE. So I decided that summer to go once a week and run a mile in the high school track. And maybe the first or second time I did it, me and my best friend got jumped by some older boys and beat up. So that stopped. I didn't keep going, and I didn't join cross country that year. At the end of 9th grade I did join track a little bit late, and ended up joining cross country my 10th grade year. So all this time I was still embarrassed at my weight. Once I started running track, I lost 5 or 10 pounds. I was thin. I continued to grow upward and was 5'11" in high school and kept growing a little bit past 6 feet. But again, I was obsessed with my weight. So after 9th grade I was running. I knew how to run 4 miles, 5 miles every day, and I went to Canada to stay with my grandparents for the summer again. One thing I would do to joke around is I would stand on my head, or at the time I was flexible, I'd put my feet behind my legs and joke around like that. It would make my grandfather sort of chuckle and laugh. And one day I asked him, sort of proud of myself, that I was, one of 145 pounds and that I had lost some weight. And, even though I was a few inches taller than my grandfather, I asked him one day, "Grandpa, how much did you weigh when you were my age?" And he took a few seconds to think about it, and his mood sort of changed to serious. And he said, he looked like he started to tear up. He said, "When I was your age, I was less than 100 pounds. And my response was, "Pah! Shut up. Don't joke around." I thought he was kidding. I really didn't think it was possible. I mean, I had been 114 pounds in 6th grade. So to think of a 16, 17-year-old boy under 100 pounds, that just didn't seem right. Then he took a breath and got a bit sadder and said, "When I was your age, I was in a camp. And I almost died." And so he started to tell me a little bit about the story of being in a forced labor camp, or somewhat like a concentration camp. And halfway through it, I just couldn't even stand it. I ran to the bathroom and started crying and bawling, and washed my face and tried to clean up and went back. At the time, no one in my family really knew, except my grandmother, what my grandparents had gone through during World War II. And I myself didn't know the 3 or 4 countries they went through, and nearly starving. And so when I went back, my grandfather told me a bit more about the story, and then I just had to run back to my room and start writing it down. I'll never forget the day. It was 2 days before my birthday, July 24th, 1994. And so I started writing, something I wish I was more consistent about. And it was kind of the first time I'd ever written anything down, per se, other than for school. And so I wrote that evening in my bed. This evening, out of curiosity, I asked my grandfather how large he was when he was my age. I wondered how big and strong he was as a teenager. What I learned was something far beyond what mere words can describe. I found a piece of my past hidden deep within my grandfather's life. My past, my life. An event so moving and touching that I instantly transformed my appreciation and respect for my ancestors, the trials they've gone through to get us where we are today. I've never written a journal, nor do I intend to do so again, but this day is special, a day I want to remember the way it is. What I learned was the struggle to survive and the will to continue with life, the determination that was what brought me here today. Not my determination, but someone else's. It is 11:30 p.m. I'm in a room in Canada. My grandfather is laying down in the room next to mine. He's not asleep. Maybe I know now why he doesn't sleep so much, but lies awake thinking. Maybe fear of the ungovernable state of slumber, the drifting of one's mind. Maybe he lies awake thinking about where he is now, how hard it was to get here. Maybe this or maybe that. My grandfather and I were sitting on his balcony, on the second story of my grandparents' house. He built the balcony himself, out of wood, by hand, with a hammer and nail, to relax with my grandmother. It was beginning to get dark outside. The air was crisp and refreshing. We were surrounded by beautiful green mountains. It's the most satisfying place to think as the sky, brown and orange from the sun, slowly descends into the distant horizon. It's 2 days before my birthday, and I was staring at my grandfather thinking, boy, I sure am scrawny and skinny compared to him. He's not extremely large, about 5'5", 5'6", but he looks strong. He looks to be worn out, a man of 70 years that show. He is quiet and soft-spoken. I finally asked Jijo, the Ukrainian name for Grandpa, how much he weighed when he was my age. I expected to hear 160 or 170 pounds. He said that when he was about 17 years old, he weighed under 100 pounds. That quickly put a smile on my face. I thought he was joking. Shut up, I said. He was not. And I thought, how could my grandfather be so puny? I looked at him for a while as he thought. He began to speak, telling me that at one time he was sick and weighed very little. I was astonished. I asked him in amazement, in Ukrainian, how could this be? And he began to tell me. It was during the German Holocaust that he was 16 or 17. He lived in what he refers to as Macedonia. It was being maintained by the Germans, and he had to stand in line every night to get food at a cafeteria. You had to be in a perfectly straight line, or the SS would discipline you at their discretion. Punishment usually consisted of a beating. One day they hit a man, and that man couldn't stand it anymore, so he fought back. He couldn't take being treated like an animal any longer, and a riot started. The soldiers quickly came and began beating everyone around the area with swords that were still in their pouch. They hit the people with cruelty and ignorance, and for some reason, ironically, my grandfather didn't even feel much like eating that day, and he wasn't there. It was strange not wanting to have dinner when you hardly had any food for days or weeks, but he had escaped the riot. However, regardless of involvement or not, all the men in the area were taken to prison for their rebellion. My grandfather was taken into a minimum security prison. He said the living conditions were terrible. People were mistreated and many suffered from malnutrition. Winter was approaching and he was forced to do harsh manual labor in coal mines at temperatures as low as 0 degrees and below. He had nothing with him more than a thin suit they had provided. They had to sleep on the floor, or he did. There was no more room. In the corner of a cell. His health quickly diminished. To this day, my grandfather can't really sleep near concrete ground without having his legs begin to ache and burn, and his chest become severely congested. People used to think it's all in his mind. When he would say that his legs ached as he slept on the lower floor of his house, I thought he was being a little bit silly. But it's a concrete floor covered in thin carpet. Time passed and he struggled to do what he was told. He couldn't eat. When he tried to eat a small piece of bread, he said blood would begin to drop down from his nose and mouth. He lost 20 pounds and more. My grandfather looked at me with sullen, desolate eyes, light blue, exhausted, calm and serene, an overwhelming amount of peace in them. As I stare into his eyes, I feel as though I'm looking through, a clear glass window. Beyond the wrinkles and the years, I see his soul. It brings me a quiet, lonely sadness, but there's a great beauty in those eyes. The sun setting, the deepest, bluest sea can't really compare. For the first time, I saw tears. I saw suffering and pain in those eyes. He whimpered in soft sobs as he thought. I began to silently cry. This lasted a moment before I thought about running away, just getting up, running to my room, putting a pillow over my head and crying. I pictured doing this in my mind. I just thought about running through that door. Then I looked at him and waited, and he waited as he cried, and then he spoke, and he told me some more. He was placed in a special section of the prison camp. The section resembled a hospital, and he had a fever. There were many other sick men there. My grandfather was alone. Most of the others, they had some visitors, but my grandfather, he didn't. He would lie there and cry with what little energy he had. Someone next to him asked why he didn't have any visitors. Doesn't your family know you will die soon? That's where this place is. It's where they put us to die. My grandfather explained that his family was some 200 miles away and couldn't afford to come visit. He thought about what the man said. He was going to die. One night he had a dream. He envisioned himself under a furnace, the furnace of his kitchen. He sat crouched beside it and cried out, "Mama, Mama," but she seemed not to hear. He then heard his mother say to his brother, "Let's write to Wasyl," and his brother replied in the dream, "Why should we write to him if he's here?" His mother said, "Wasyl, if you're here, then why can't I see you?" Then he said to her, "Mama, it's because only my spirit is here." My grandfather cried, and he cried and cried as he stared at me blankly. He seemed to be looking back and envisioning himself as a young boy my age, the way he felt near death, his spirit beginning to leave him. He may have given up, he said, if his mom didn't answer his calling in the dream. Before this he felt abandoned and alone, and I can't imagine the pain and suffering he felt as he lay on his deathbed with no one to comfort him, no family or friends. He was dying in the hands of hateful people, only 17 years old and forced to experience the loneliness of an old dying man without hope. He knew of no God and was terribly afraid to die. And he cried so passionately when he said, "I would have died without a God." After the dream, he said he felt his spirit returning to his body. He woke to find he had been in a coma, something then thought to have been a death sentence in the camp. He didn't really know how long he was in the coma, but it didn't matter to the SS whether he lived or died. He thought he was in the coma for maybe 2 weeks. When he recovered, the conditions in the camp seemed worse. One of his friends couldn't bear it. He had taken his own life. As the train backed slowly into its car, the tons of mass gliding down the train tracks, preparing to meet each other. As the two cars pushed into one another, a young boy ran towards them and got in between the two. He wanted the pain to stop, the suffering, and the great force crushed and killed my grandfather's friend instantly. Such suicides weren't uncommon. The men's sanity left them and their hope was lost. They held on to their hopes as a child to their mother's hand, and my grandfather looked at me in the eye when he admitted he thought of it. The suffering gave him thoughts of suicide. He didn't remember what stopped him from doing it. He says it was much easier to do what his friend did than continue living in pain. But he now understood that God didn't want him dead. While my grandfather was coming out of his coma, his mother was some 200 miles away trying very, very passionately to persuade officials to let her son go. They were useless attempts. His mother spoke fluent German and thought she could convince the officials. She made the determination to get her son, and soon she did. She got to him to visit. Somehow, his mother persuaded the officials to let her take her recovering son for a walk. They just let her. They needed to walk 10 kilometers to get away, and about halfway, a German soldier on a bicycle stopped, and the mother and her son were caught. The man on the bike asked, "Where do you think you're taking him?" And his mother said she was simply taking her son on a walk. My grandfather said that when he saw the soldier, he thought he would be sent back. And something strange happened. The soldier looked into his mother's eyes, as though to say, "I understand what you're risking for your son." And speaking German, they said, "Okay, just don't go and leave the camp by mistake." This man gave my grandfather his freedom. He showed compassion and understanding that the love of a mother has for her child. They made their way to the train station. It was full of soldiers who my grandfather said were seeming to stare at him. It was probably all in his mind, because they made their escape. He was sick and poor and hardly had anything to eat. He was lucky enough to soon find a job at a factory making glass objects. He knew the soldiers were bound to find him, and when they did, they saw he had a job and was causing no problems, so they let him work and didn't send him back. He worked on the lower floor, and above him was a woman he would meet in the future, a woman he was destined to spend the rest of his life with, my grandmother. My grandfather didn't believe his struggling made him through it all, nor did he believe it was pure luck that helped him get through it all. He said it was God, the God he didn't yet know. Years later he came to know God, and he became a great preacher for his language and his time and where he was. He was admired by others for his wisdom, his patience, his generosity and good heart, and his willingness to help others. A humble man sat before me, tears in his eyes, telling me of his destiny. He shows me the scars on his body, the injury of his hand, and he reminds me of the time he brought home a grenade. He was little and his parents didn't know what it was. He put it near the stove and it began to make a noise. It blew up, and he injured his brothers and sisters pretty bad. Pieces flew into his body, and there was no doctor to take the pieces out, so they did it themselves, or just left it be. Part of his left hand was blown away, and it didn't hurt as much when he left his hand closed. The skin healed together as he kept his hand closed, and now he has a partly webbed little finger, and his left hand doesn't open completely. Many other times he was near death and ill or in hunger, starving, but he wasn't allowed to die. I believe it was destiny. Although he's not famous or well known, he has helped hundreds, maybe thousands of people in his lifetime. And I'm sure they've helped people as well. He helped in ways that only they can really appreciate. Some small, very significant things a person does in a time of need or in a time of desperation or tragedy. He would never hesitate to sacrifice his possessions, his time, his work, anything. Many times he sacrificed not only luxuries but necessities for his family and friends and for those around him. Food and shelter to a man who needs it when he and his family were hungry, and giving the best he had to offer to the guest. His wedding ring was lent to people who couldn't afford one during the Depression after the war. It was just constantly used at weddings for different poor people in the refugee camp. They didn't ask for it or expect it back. They let it go for the sake of need. Countless numbers of times he's done my work for me, work put off through laziness, chores and things I was tasked to do that I avoided. He often fixes my things secretly when they're not working right. The precious moments when I do something, a project, or something of that sort, and he comes beside me to help without saying a word. He and my grandmother have an enormous garden full of fruit and vegetables. Those who he knows have, at one time or another, had some of those fruits and vegetables that he has shared. He always shares his knowledge and wisdom when it's needed, and sometimes when it's not. But he doesn't rebuke or do things looking down on you, but always because he loves you and because he wants to help correct and do things that are nurturing and that benefit your well-being. Because of him, there is me. He has given me a great part of his knowledge and patience, his silence, his deepness of thought, life. He gave me the opportunities he could have only hoped for, maybe better. The pain, the suffering, the torture, they were all to better me and my family. He still sacrifices for his children and for their children, and there's no real way to appreciate what he's done for me. I can only try to live my life to its fullest, make him proud, serve God, and help others. I need to use what he gave me, the advantages, the knowledge, the experiences of his life, and do what he did for his children. There seems to be an unfairness. He has given his whole life to better mine, and he never enjoys what he's done. Well, maybe there's an unbelievable satisfaction in seeing your kids and grandkids happy and living a life where they're not wanting and never in need. Is there anything I could give him? I feel I owe a debt that can never be paid. The sum is too large. Thank you. Thank you. Those were the words I wrote on July 24th, 1994. It was in the next couple of years that I would buy a mini cassette recorder and begin to record the stories and ask questions whenever I would visit and get the chance, trying to learn more about my grandparents' past, their history, what they went through, what they enjoyed and experienced, and how they suffered. Little did I know the valuable or invaluable perspective I was gaining. Just a little glimpse into where I came from that not everybody gets to see. And so I wish we all understood the way I was fortunate to begin to understand just how blessed and fortunate we are, anyone who's alive today, and the amount of sacrifice, the amount of sweat and tears, suffering, the amount of hunger, and the amount of death that came along with it people have sacrificed to get us here and to move us on towards a better life. This is both a gift and an obligation to help others as well, because without those who helped us, we would be nothing and probably wouldn't be here. There was another thing I wrote in 1999, the last visit I would make to Canada before my grandparents would move in 2000 to live with my parents. Eventually my grandfather passing in 2001, or actually July of 2002. This was on July 23rd, 1999. He stared at me from across the room as we sat on the sofas. I'd noticed him staring at me the last day or two, today even more. I would catch him staring at me for a while with no expression on his face. But he was looking at me. It wasn't a blank stare. I would look back at him and not say anything, as if to ask, "Why are you looking at me?" Other times I would stare back and smile, thinking about him and his youth, of me, of his age. One time he stared at me long and hard and then finally said, "I love you," in his broken English. "I will never forget you as long as I live. You are in me always." He touched his chest with his hand and lightly pounded it. He did not smile. He only looked a bit sad and maybe a bit proud. Later he looked at me again and said, "You are part of me. You are from my body and my flesh." Then he looked at me some more, thinking about what he said. I had taken a walk and gone down to town for the evening. It was such a small town and pretty safe to get around, even in the nighttime. I came home that night after 11 p.m. and the house was dark. I walked up the stairs to my grandfather's room and leaned over him. His eyes were closed. I thought he didn't hear me, so I stood there watching him. He must have felt my looking at him, because he opened his eyes, almost startled, with a gasp of air. He looked at me for several seconds, as though unsure of my existence. Then he extended his arm, touched my face on my cheek, and moved his hand down to my chin affectionately, realizing that I wasn't a ghost standing in front of him. "I'm home," I whispered loudly, because he wasn't very good at hearing. "Okay, Johnny." It was the last time I was in that home, and I was awake at 1:30 a.m. because I couldn't sleep. I heard my grandfather get up and walk to the kitchen, slow, weary, and desiring rest. I went there from the threshold, watched him. He hadn't noticed me yet. The dim oven light made things visible as he pulled an old, hardened piece of bread from the refrigerator and slowly shuffled to the counter. I went around to his right side, stepping loudly so he wouldn't be startled by me as he had been earlier. He saw me and smiled. He broke a piece of bread and began chewing it with his front teeth, the only ones that weren't worn out, the only ones he could use. With his mouth somewhat full, he grabbed a few cherries that were resting on the counter and pushed them into his mouth. I looked at the soggy cherries that sat on a small plate. I wasn't willing to eat them the last 2 weeks because they had gotten so old. My grandfather had canned them a while back after picking them from the backyard trees. I took one and put it in my mouth, noticing the wrinkled skin and mushy inside. I chewed and swallowed. After the first one, I forgot about how old they were and I took 2 more, and he took 1. Then he took 1, and I took another one. And I ate, not because I was hungry, and not because I wanted the cherries, but because he was my grandfather, and he had made them, and it meant something to him if I enjoyed them. And I did. The plate was soon emptied, and he stood chewing, hunched over and leaning on the counter. I pushed myself up onto the counter, next to the sink, as I had when I used to wash dishes as a child, and watched him in the dim light. I saw an old man, a man who was pacified by age, having lost his youth. He finished eating and made a 90-degree turn, facing me. "That's all," he exclaimed, showing me the palms of his hands were empty. Then he stepped closer and put up his 2 hands, moving like a boxer, ready to fight. I jumped off the counter and faced him for a moment. He took another step forward and embraced me under my armpits, resting his head for several seconds on the side of my neck. He moved, beginning to let go of me, and I felt his lips pressed against my shoulder right above my chest, where he kissed me. It was sort of where he reached. At 21 years old, I was 5'11", going on 6 feet. He was maybe half a foot shorter. I was momentarily stunned when he kissed me. I kissed his forehead and looked at him. He seemed to be fighting emotions, trying not to cry. He just looked at me without saying a word. His eyes penetrated me in such a way that I thought he could see my insides. I hadn't seen my grandfather express this kind of emotion for many years. I walked to my room and closed the door. I lay in bed with the lights off for 20 minutes, and I cried. Like a baby, I cried. It was the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done to me. I don't know, it was almost as if Christ had kissed my feet. I just felt so undeserving, unworthy of such a great man as a grandfather, so I cried. Thinking about what he said to me earlier that night, that I was part of him, of his flesh, I cried. I cried for him and I cried for me. Because he is in me, he was once me, and because one day I will be him. I thought of a child with torn pants, working at the age of 7. Of a man who in generosity gave my grandfather pants that were less torn than his own, and how in a fit of anger on the pastures of Ukraine that same man beat my grandfather, tearing his pants off and throwing the shredded one at his feet. I thought about that boy, how he probably didn't understand why this would happen. Why did he and his family have it so bad? And was it better to have something like those pants for a moment and then have it taken away? I thought of the anger the child should grow up with, the rage that should grow inside him when he's forced to leave home, forced to go hungry, forced to face the harsh cruelties of life that he didn't deserve. I mean, after all, he was only born. To endure bombings, war, a labor camp, to be separated from your family and never understand if you'll be able to see them again, dying and not even knowing what country you were in. I thought of the cruelties that had pushed him so far he didn't want to live because it seemed so wrong the way the world was in those camps. I thought about the old man now who can't stretch out his arms and legs, the severe way in which he was forced to live, and now unable to move, wasting away, constantly in pain. And yet he was me, and I am him. It's almost as if I got to see it all. So that night, I cried and cried, like a child. And a lot of those tears were pure gratitude. A gratitude that could never be completely paid. There's a lot more to this story. I think I'll have to write it down. It might be itself a book. Just the days leading up into the death of my grandmother. My grandmother suffered a lot before the end. She had many, many years where she was in a lot of pain. Her husband died in 2002, and in 2017 she still wondered why God kept her around when she was in so much pain and suffering, and no longer with the man she loved. Her mind started to go a bit. She was 96, and she started to think the last few years that maybe they were poisoning her. First that the nurses were, and then that the doctors were, and then that maybe her family had signed her up to be poisoned. And it broke my mom's heart. My mom would do anything for her. My grandparents moved in with my mother in 2001. It broke everyone's heart when in July 3rd, 2002, my grandfather passed away. So from 2002 until 2017, my grandmother was alone, or without her husband, is what I mean. And it was very, very difficult. My grandmother would even rub at her head profusely, saying she could push the poison out when she did that. She could feel it, she said, and had rubbed her head nearly raw, losing most of her hair because of it. The doctors wanted to take her in to see what was going on and see if they could help her. The ambulance came to take her, and she refused to go to get the checkup. She said, "Leave me alone, I'm going to sleep now," the nurse said, and that they would try again tomorrow. My mother texted this to me on March 16, 2017. She said, "I have not only worry now, but wonder what's going to happen. I feel bad for her. My heart is crushing, because I love her dearly. She's difficult. I feel bad about her scratching, her behavior, and suffering. I've been praying so hard. I don't know what else to do." My grandmother wanted to pass away for years now. "Why, oh why is God making me suffer like this?" she would say. The more she wanted to go, the more anxious she was, the more miserable she probably made herself. I drove down Highway 19 on a Saturday in order to go see my grandmother, to meet my mother there. All these things had happened leading up into this week, which I want to write about and talk about. But at that moment, because of these things, I had something put on my heart, and I thought to myself in the car, I need to tell Babcha, what I called my grandmother. I need to tell Babcha I'm writing a book. Maybe it'll help her pass, or at least be a bit less bitter and suffer less. And that was it, a passing thought. I saw my mom. I met her at the front door, and we walked down the hallway. She made little noises with her cane with each step, a little bit of clicking on the ground. Every now and then I'd arrive before her and hear her down the hallway with the clicking. It was hard for her to sneak up on anyone with that sound. My mom had obviously been worried, and she had been really, really worn out over the years, first taking care of her father, and then taking care of her mother, and her husband beginning to get ill and show the effects of Parkinson's. But what really, really crushed her was the accusations that we were poisoning her, or that, maybe she said, my father had given her some disease at the hospital where he was a chaplain. The visit was nothing extraordinary. My grandmother wanted to wash up, so my mom wheeled her to the bathroom, and she went in and locked the door. I thought about the previous week and was a bit worried. Would she start throwing a fit, keep herself in the bathroom? What if she locks herself inside? The first few times something like this happens, you don't know what to do, or you plead. And then I don't know if you just get more patience or desensitized or what. In fact, my grandmother started having more and more fits when we would leave, begin to cry or scream out. It was hard not to stay a bit longer when someone was so sad to see you go. But she washed up in about 10 minutes and came out without any problems. We wheeled her back to bed and chatted a bit. She just didn't seem to want to talk much. And she lay down. She kept her eyes open and moaned a bit. Sometimes we weren't really even sure if she was in pain or just trying to make us feel bad. I didn't know what to expect anymore. You feel bad even suggesting that. We hadn't stayed very long compared to usual. You might stay a couple of hours, 2.5, maybe 3. We had stayed maybe 30 minutes, maybe 40. My mom could tell my grandmother just didn't really seem to want us there and asked me if we should leave. I don't know why, but I told her to wait a few more minutes, and we did, sitting there, watching her, feeling badly. Finally, my mom asked her, "Mama, do you want us to go?" And my grandmother just lay on her pillow, staring off into space. And she nodded her head, yeah. My mother and I stood up to go. My grandmother looked up at me and said, in Ukrainian, "I love you, Johnny." We always spoke in Ukrainian. Almost rarely did we speak in English. "And you," she said to my mother, lifting her left hand and wagging her finger at her, somewhat playfully, almost bossy. "And you, don't you think for 1 second that I didn't know how much you love me. I don't need to tell you that. Ти не думаєш за секунд, що я не знав, як ти мене любив. Я не мушу тобі сказати то." I smiled. She settled back down and said, "Не забудь меня. Don't forget me." And at the time I took it to mean, keep visiting. Don't forget to come visit me. It was no doubt lonely and depressing in the nursing home. I mean, we would get depressed visiting. There were patients who were sick, confused, some of them screaming. And others, well, I got to know some of them, like the young lady who was a quadriplegic and sat in the front every day. She'd say hello with her computer, and sometimes as you'd walk out the door, you'd hear the computer begin to say goodbye in monotone. But it was a difficult place to be. Then it hit me, what I was thinking in the car, and I remembered. I had almost forgotten. I went to her bedside and said, "Babcha, Babcha," and it felt like a movie. I rushed to her ear and shouted, "Grandma, Grandma," it meant. "Babcha, Babcha, I'll never forget you, we'll never forget you. I remember all the stories you told me growing up. All of them. I'm writing a book so that everyone in our family knows where we came from, how we got to be the way we are. We will never forget you. Never. I remember all of it. All of it. Sho, sho." I felt a sense of urgency and my eyes were filled with tears. Her eyes also welled up with tears. She waited a moment thinking about it and started nodding her head. I hugged and kissed her. It's as if she understood. And she lay back down and closed her eyes. We left the room, clicking down the hallway. Mimi's going to visit on Tuesday, my mom said. My sister was on spring break and was going to be able to come see her. It's so strange, Johnny, my mom said. She seems better than usual. Different. I don't know. We walked a few steps, and she sighed. God forgive me, but I don't know why he's keeping her for so long, making her suffer. I only wish God would take her. I know, I said. My grandmother had suffered. Even before old age, she had suffered many, many times in her youth. And she had been unhappy for so long recently. How many times she asked God why he was making her suffer, because she didn't understand. She couldn't understand why he was keeping her here. She wanted peace, and she wanted to be with her husband. I agreed, but didn't say anything. We said our goodbyes outside, and I drove 10 or 15 minutes to see my mentor, Mr. Cotton. And again, there's so much more to it. So many things leading up to this that were, I don't know, it just can't be coincidental. From my students to my neighbor to the old man across the street, even to what I posted the following day on a Monday. I posted a picture of my grandfather because it just hit me, family, and where I came from. And in my post I said, before leaving Canada on the 23rd of July, 1999, he stared at me from across the room as we sat on the sofas. I had noticed him staring at me the last day or two, but today even more. I wrote what he said. You are a part of me. You are from my body and my flesh. Then he stared at me some more, contemplating what he said with his worn, rugged face. I didn't write all of it. I finished by saying, such a beautiful man, someone who I will forever be chasing to try and be as good of a person as, or as funny as, or kind as, or strong as him. Someone who literally made me the way I am, because he helped me understand the suffering, like being in a concentration camp. He taught me about life, and about miracles, like his mother walking him out of the labor camp on the very edge of death, and the mystery of life, having a mother who, a hero during the war, helping many people get food and clothing, died 2 short years later from dirty water. If I'm anything, I end the post, it's because of all of you, and because of him, and because of all of these things we learn, everything leading toward being able to love. That is where happiness is pointing, toward everyone else who will help us and love. This is my best post. It will always be. And my most proud. Not long afterward, I posted a picture of my mother. I said, I guess it takes a while to grow up and realize just how special and beautiful your mom is, or how you got here. Eugenia was born in a refugee camp in West Germany. Her parents raced to the West after the war. A year later, my mom was born in Aschaffenburg. Maybe she was a celebration of the end of the war, of hope. A few years later, half of the family went to Australia, and she and her family went to the outskirts of the jungles of Caracas, in Venezuela. She nearly died when their neighbors poisoned the water supply. Upset, they switched religions, it would seem. Don't worry. I'll write about it if anyone is interested. Soon. We can only be here because of each other. We need to be better. That is what the tough times show. We only ended Hitler together. And it was horrific, but we did. Look at us now, loving, and all the grandkids and great-grandkids and great-great-grandkids, because my grandmother was a great-great-grandmother at the time, having met her great-great-grandson for the first time that year. And we're all trying to be their best. We all go back far enough, and it's a similar story. So many good things like computers, and such a big world. Let's remind each other. We really need each other. And I ended the post. with a beautiful poem by Rumi, a 13th century Islamic poet. I see my beauty in you. I become a mirror that cannot close its eyes to your longing. My eyes wet with yours in the early light. My mind, every moment giving birth, always conceiving, always in the 9th month, and then an empty sky, and everything is soul and flowering. Everything is soul and flowering. How do I stand this? We become these words we say, this poetry. I never know what I'm going to say, I don't plan it. When I'm outside the saying of it, I hardly speak at all. And after years of loving Rumi, I began to understand his deep, deep love and compassion, not for a woman, but for the Lord, for the Creator, and for something bigger. I see his beauty in all of us. Like I said, there's a lot more to it. So many things connected and coincidental leading up to this. Like talking about my grandmother and grandfather in the camp to my class, and then having my student come tell me her grandmother was dying of cancer, and had been since the summer. After speaking to my grandmother that day, I got a text in the morning that my student's grandmother had passed away. And like I said, I made some posts of my own about my grandfather and my mother, understanding the beauty of my family and where I came from, and how blessed I am to be able to know some of my story. Monday, which was the day after I spoke to my grandmother for the last time, I went to do yoga in my own room, but I went to do yoga around 7 o'clock. And at 6:58, I got a text message from my mother. Johnny, we tried calling you, but the phone says it's not accepting calls. We have some really bad news. Babcha passed away at 6:04 p.m. I'm sorry I have to tell you by texting. 10 days or so had passed since they tried to take her to the ambulance. I texted my mom that I'd be there in 10 or 15 minutes. Even finding myself behind an ambulance on the way to see my grandmother for the last time. I was about to pull over and let the ambulance pass by when I realized all these coincidences it must be for me. So I cruised behind the ambulance, and I made it in record time to my grandmother's nursing home, where she lay, resting finally in peace and with the Lord. I just couldn't believe it. My mom had called me before I left, and she was hysterical. She couldn't even think straight. I kept trying to say, my mama, what I told her yesterday. Mama, thinking, oh my goodness. Maybe what I told her gave her some peace. Maybe she needed to know that she was never going to be forgotten, at least by me. And maybe she had some peace knowing that the things that she and her husband went through to get us all to where we are here in America wouldn't be forgotten and lost. We would know where we came from just a little bit.